Stop right there. Is that my son? Laura's heart froze as she saw him, Paul, her ex-billionaire, staring at Jack across the schoolyard after 5 long years. She thought she'd hidden him from the world, from Paul, from the man who abandoned them. But now, everything she fought to protect is at risk. He's back, watching, waiting, and nothing will ever be the same. Watch what happens when past betrayals collide with the love she's been hiding, and how one day at school could change everything. Where are you listening from today? And who's joining me? Any of my loyal viewers with me right now? Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. And now, let's dive in. Laura adjusted Jack's collar slowly, deliberately, as though the small act required her full concentration, her fingertips smoothing the fabric at his throat while the morning unfolded around them with noisy indifference. Parents flowing past in hurried streams, voices overlapping, laughter clashing with impatience, the scent of coffee and exhaust hanging low in the air like a fog of routine. The school gate stood wide and welcoming, bright banners fluttering above it, a place designed to promise safety and beginnings, yet Laura felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came every morning before she let go of his hand, because loving fiercely meant learning to release without breaking. The early sun caught her brown, smooth skin and warmed it gently, but the warmth did nothing to soften the alertness etched into her posture, the kind of vigilance earned through years of being the only adult in the room, the only shield between a child and a world that did not offer mercy freely. She smiled anyway, because Jack watched her face more than he listened to her words, because children absorbed emotion like air, because fear was a luxury she could not afford to pass down. "Eyes forward, champion," she said softly, her voice measured, light enough to sound playful, steady enough to hide the truth of how her pulse ticked faster with every passing second. Jack beamed at her, wide and unburdened, the grin of a boy who believed completely in the solidity of the ground beneath his feet, who trusted that the hand that buttoned his jacket would always be there when he reached back. He wrapped his arms around her waist in a quick, fierce hug, the kind that knocked the breath from her lungs in the best way, grounding her in the simple reality of his weight, his warmth, his existence. And then he was gone, darting toward the entrance with unrestrained confidence, never once turning to check if she was still watching, because she had taught him that goodbyes did not need fear to be real. Laura remained where she was, eyes following the familiar sway of his backpack, until he disappeared into the sea of uniforms and chatter, her lungs finally releasing the breath she'd been holding. Relief settling in like a fragile glass ornament balanced on the edge of a shelf. This was the moment she usually allowed herself, a half-second of quiet victory, a silent acknowledgement that she had done it again, that she had delivered him safely from one day to the next. But the relief shattered almost instantly, not with sound, not with movement, but with a sensation so sharp it felt like a hand closing around her spine. She stiffened, every nerve waking at once, the instinctive response of someone who had learned the hard way that danger did not always announce itself. The feeling of being watched crept over her skin, slow and deliberate, raising the fine hairs at the nape of her neck, dragging her attention backward even as her body resisted turning. She knew this feeling. It was the same awareness that had followed her through silent hallways and echoing courtrooms, through moments when eyes weighed her worth without permission, when judgment lingered just beyond her line of sight. Her face remained composed, lips pressed into a neutral line, years of emotional control holding firm while her mind raced through possibilities, through exits, through reasons that made sense and reasons that didn't. She told herself she was tired. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself that mornings were chaotic and paranoia was easy. Across the street, amid the disorder of honking cars and double-parked vans, something stood out precisely because it did not belong. A black luxury car idled at the curb, immaculate and motionless, its polished surface reflecting the fractured light of the street, its presence heavy in a way that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with intention. The engine was silent, the windows dark, as if it were holding its breath. Laura's gaze flicked toward it almost against her will, her stomach tightening as recognition stirred without context. The driver's side window lowered slowly, unhurried, the deliberate pace sending a chill through her veins, because whoever was inside understood the weight of anticipation, understood how power worked when it did not need to rush. Her heart slammed violently the moment she saw his face, the world narrowing to a single, unbearable point of clarity. Paul. The name echoed without sound, memories crashing into the present so abruptly she had to anchor herself to the pavement beneath her feet. Time had marked him, sharpened his features, refined him into something colder and more controlled, but his eyes were the same, unmistakable in their intensity, their focus, their ability to make her feel suddenly exposed. 5 years dissolved in an instant, replaced by images she had buried with purpose, legal documents signed in silence, unanswered calls, the weight of carrying life alone, while he chased things that glittered louder than responsibility. And then she realized, with a cold certainty that stole her breath, that he was not looking at her at all. His gaze was fixed past her shoulder, locked onto the school entrance, onto the space where Jack had just vanished, onto a truth she had guarded with ferocity and fear. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something breaking through the composed mask, something like recognition, like calculation, like loss. Laura's chest tightened painfully as understanding settled in her bones. He was not watching a stranger's child. He was watching his son, even if he did not yet know the full weight of that word. Panic surged hot and fast, clawing at her throat, but she crushed it down with practiced efficiency, turning away before the tremor in her hands could betray her. She forced herself to walk, to blend back into the flow of parents dispersing, to act as though the past had not just stepped out of the shadows and into her carefully constructed present. The school bell rang, sharp and decisive, sealing Jack inside the building, separating him from her reach, and the sound echoed through her chest like a warning. She did not look back again. She did not need to. She could feel the car still there, feel the weight of Paul's attention pressing into her back, feel the fragile equilibrium of her life tilting dangerously. Each step away from the gate felt heavier than the last, her mind racing through consequences she had postponed for years, through questions she had never planned to answer, through the terrifying knowledge that secrets survived only as long as no one recognized them. Behind her, the black car remained idling, patient and unmoving, a silent witness to a morning that refused to stay buried, and Laura knew with grim certainty that whatever came next would demand more than survival. It would demand reckoning. 2. Laura turned away instantly, not out of cowardice, but out of instinct, sharpened by years of discipline, forcing her body to move before her mind could fracture under the weight of recognition, her shoulders squaring as if she were merely another parent heading back toward the street, another woman resuming a routine morning. She pressed panic down hard, burying it beneath layers of control she had built brick by brick since the day she learned survival required silence as much as strength, telling herself that fear was only useful if it led somewhere actionable. Her thoughts raced anyway, clashing with logic, reaching desperately for denial because denial was easier than reckoning. She told herself she was mistaken, that memory had a way of sharpening faces unfairly, that wealthy men were manufactured from the same mold, tailored suits, controlled expressions, eyes trained to observe without revealing intent, and that distance could distort certainty into illusion if you wanted it badly enough. She kept walking, counting her steps, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes, to the distant shouts of children filtering through the schoolyard fence, anchoring herself to sound and motion so she wouldn't turn around again. But the sense of being watched did not fade. It thickened, settled between her shoulder blades like a hand that refused to lift. Against her better judgment, she slowed, her resolve wavering under the pressure of unanswered questions, and she glanced back just once, quick and sharp, the way you look when you already know what you will see but hope the universe might surprise you out of mercy. The black car was still there, exactly where it had been, its presence unchanged, deliberate, patient. And Paul's eyes were still fixed on the same point, unwavering, not tracking her movement, not acknowledging her escape, but locked onto the schoolyard with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. He wasn't looking at her. That truth landed harder the second time. He was watching Jack. Laura's mouth opened on a soundless denial, a single word forming instinctively because refusal felt like the last line of defense she had left. "No," she whispered under her breath, the sound thin and useless against the rush of fear crawling up her spine, cold fingers tracing every consequence she had avoided naming. Inside the schoolyard, Jack's laughter rang out, clear and bright, cutting through her panic with cruel innocence, and the sound twisted something deep in her chest because it existed so completely outside the gravity of what was unfolding. He laughed, without knowing that his face, his posture, the careless tilt of his head had just detonated a man's life across the street, had cracked open a past Laura had sealed with intention and pain. Her hand went to her phone without conscious thought, fingers trembling as they wrapped around the familiar shape, muscle memory overriding indecision, because this was the moment when most people called for help, for backup, for reassurance that they were not alone. Her thumb hovered over the screen, over names she trusted, over emergency numbers that promised intervention. But she didn't dial. She couldn't. There was no immediate danger, no crime being committed, no explanation she could offer that wouldn't unravel everything she had fought to keep intact. Calling someone would make this real in a way she was not ready to survive. So she held the phone tightly instead, as if sheer grip could anchor her reality, her pulse thundering loud enough she was certain it must be visible. Across the street, Paul did nothing. He didn't step out of the car. He didn't raise a hand in greeting or demand answers or attempt to cross the distance between them. He didn't chase, didn't confront, didn't call out her name the way he once had in moments of impatience or entitlement. He simply remained where he was, watching, absorbing, committing every detail to memory, with the precision of a man who understood instinctively that this moment mattered more than impulse. Laura noticed then how still he was, how restraint seemed to wrap around him like armor, and that unsettled her far more than anger would have. Rage could be predicted. Control suggested calculation. Her thoughts spiraled, darting between past and present, between the woman she had been and the one she had forced herself to become. She remembered the way Paul used to look at opportunities, at acquisitions, at anything he intended to claim, the way his attention narrowed until the rest of the world blurred into irrelevance. Seeing that same focus now, directed at a child who shared his blood, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. She wondered how much he saw already, how many similarities he had catalogued in the span of a few minutes, how quickly a man like him could connect dots once curiosity turned into certainty. Jack ran past the fence, chasing a ball, his movements loose and unguarded, and Paul's expression shifted again, something unsteady flickering across his face before he masked it, his jaw tightening as if to physically hold himself back. Laura caught that moment and felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. This wasn't a casual observation, this wasn't coincidence. This was recognition in its earliest, most dangerous stage. She realized then that the lie she had protected for 5 years, the lie that had given her control, that had given Jack stability, that had allowed her to build a life untouched by Paul's shadow, was no longer contained. It was bleeding out slowly, visibly, staining everything it touched. She turned away again, more decisively this time, forcing her legs to move even as her mind lagged behind, because staying any longer would mean surrendering to paralysis, and paralysis had never saved anyone. The city swallowed her as she walked, noise and motion closing in, but the awareness followed, relentless. Behind her, the car still did not move. Paul did not follow. He did not need to. He had seen enough for now, and Laura understood with chilling clarity that this was not the end of the confrontation. It was the beginning of surveillance, of questions forming silently, of a future inching closer, no matter how fast she walked away. By the time she reached the corner and disappeared from view, her heart was still racing, her thoughts still tangled in contingencies she had hoped never to consider. She didn't know what Paul would do next. She didn't know how long she had before restraint gave way to action. All she knew was that the morning had shifted irrevocably, and the truth, once seen, could not be unseen. The lie was dying, and Laura was running out of time to decide what would replace it. By the time Laura reached her apartment building, the city had begun to dim into evening, the sharp edges of the morning blunted by exhaust haze and neon flicker, but the tension that had followed her from the school gate refused to loosen its grip. She climbed the stairs with mechanical focus, each step a grounding exercise, each breath measured, because if she stopped moving long enough to think too clearly, the image of Paul's eyes tracking Jack would rise again and threaten to fracture the fragile calm she had worked so relentlessly to maintain. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar warmth of her home wrapped around her like a practiced lie, comforting and earned, but no longer impenetrable. The apartment was small, undeniably so, yet every inch of it carried intention, the kind that came from building something piece by piece without help or applause. Jack's drawings covered the refrigerator in uneven layers, crayon suns and crooked houses overlapping, each one a declaration of existence, each one a reminder of nights spent choosing patience over exhaustion. The couch bore the faint indentation of shared evenings. The coffee table held school newsletters and half-finished puzzles, and the walls echoed softly with the life she had constructed out of necessity and stubborn resolve. This was not luxury. This was survival refined into comfort. Laura set her keys down carefully, as if noise itself might summon the thoughts she was trying to outrun. She moved into the kitchen and began preparing dinner on autopilot, chopping vegetables with steady precision, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board offering a fragile sense of order. Jack sat at the small table, legs swinging as he talked animatedly about his day, about a goal scored at recess, about a classmate who had shared a snack, about the ordinary triumphs that defined childhood. Laura nodded at all the right moments, smiled when expected, murmured encouragement with practiced ease, her responses calibrated to reassure without distraction. Outwardly, nothing was wrong. Inwardly, her mind replayed Paul's face like a warning sign she had passed too many times without stopping, each recollection sharper than the last, each one stripping away another layer of denial. She remembered the day she signed the divorce papers, the sterile chill of the office, the way the pen felt heavier than it should have in her hand, as if it understood the weight of what it was sealing. She had been pregnant then, her body carrying a future she had not yet fully processed, her voice small and unused in rooms where decisions were made quickly and without her. Paul had barely looked at her as she signed, distracted by calls, by calendars, by commitments that promised returns measured in profit rather than presence. She remembered thinking, not for the last time, that silence was easier than begging someone to care. The scent of food filled the apartment as she stirred the pot, grounding her briefly in the present. But memory was relentless. She remembered late nights alone, one hand on her stomach, the other balancing bills and fear, telling herself that choosing independence over neglect was not failure, but necessity. She remembered the countless moments when Paul had chosen boardrooms over apologies, expansion over explanation, power over partnership, and how each choice had carved distance that eventually became permanent. She had not hidden Jack out of malice. She had hidden him out of instinct, out of a certainty that love given inconsistently was more dangerous than love withheld entirely. Dinner passed quietly, Jack chattering through bites, Laura responding just enough to keep him anchored, her mind splitting itself in two to maintain the illusion of normalcy. When the dishes were done and the evening settled into its familiar rhythm, Jack climbed onto the couch beside her, curling instinctively into her side, resting his head against her shoulder with the ease of someone who had never doubted belonging. The weight of him pressed into her, solid and real, and for a moment the world narrowed to this. Warmth, breath, the quiet hum of a life she had fought to protect. "Mum, you okay?" he asked suddenly, his voice gentle, observant in the way that always caught her off guard, because children noticed more than adults liked to admit. Laura's throat tightened, emotion rising dangerously close to the surface, but she swallowed it down with practiced efficiency and smiled, a soft curve of the lips she had perfected over years of necessity. "I'm okay," she said, because that was what survival looked like in real time, because honesty was sometimes a burden she refused to place on his shoulders. Jack accepted the answer without pressing, content to simply exist beside her, unaware of how fiercely she was holding herself together. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, the sound slicing through the quiet like a blade, sharp and intrusive. Laura froze, every muscle locking as adrenaline surged without permission, because she already knew before she reached for it that nothing good arrived unannounced after a day like this. Her blood ran cold as she picked it up, the screen lighting her face in stark relief, an unknown number glaring back at her with quiet menace. For a split second, she considered ignoring it, letting it fade into silence, preserving the illusion of control for just a little longer. Then the message appeared. 6 words. No greeting, no explanation, just truth delivered with surgical precision. "I saw him today. We need to talk." The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as the weight of inevitability settled fully into her chest. Laura stared at the screen, pulse roaring in her ears, understanding with devastating clarity that distance and time were no longer enough to protect what she had built. Paul had crossed the threshold from observer to participant. The past had found her address, and whatever came next would demand a reckoning she could no longer postpone. Laura arrived at the cafe deliberately early, choosing the location with precision that had become instinctual over years of navigating spaces that mattered to no one but her. It was far removed from the streets Paul frequented, far from the luxury and glare of his world, chosen for anonymity and neutrality, for the assurance that no one who knew him would recognize him here, and more importantly, that no one who knew her would question her presence. She stepped through the door with quiet authority, the familiar scent of roasted coffee beans and baked pastries brushing against her senses, grounding her just enough to mask the tremor in her hands and the tension she refused to acknowledge. Every detail of the room, the soft clatter of cups, the low murmur of conversation, the sunlight slanting through tall windows and pooling on the polished wood floors, became her anchor as she moved toward the corner table she had reserved, a vantage point that allowed her to monitor the entrance without appearing vigilant, to hold her composure while bracing for the confrontation she had hoped to delay indefinitely. She remained standing, arms crossed, heels planted firmly on the tiled floor, embodying the authority she had built in the years since the divorce, the authority that had allowed her to navigate life alone without apology or compromise. Each minute that passed increased the tension, a rhythm of time that pulled her attention to the door with anticipation and anxiety, and when he arrived, the air shifted imperceptibly, charged with the gravity of the past and the unspoken reckoning of the present. Paul entered with the poise of someone accustomed to command, 36 years of calculated control radiating from him in measured steps, the faint gleam of wealth and influence apparent in the cut of his suit, the confidence in his posture, the way his gaze swept the room before finding its intended target. He looked every inch the man she had known before, the devastatingly handsome figure who had once held her heart captive with arrogance and charm, But there was an edge she had not seen before, a tremor beneath the polished surface, the shadow of a man confronted with something he could not immediately dominate or dismiss. Laura remained motionless, refusing to sit, refusing to soften. The muscles in her arms flexed under the weight of her crossed posture, her body a subtle declaration that she had reclaimed control, that the power dynamics had shifted in ways Paul would have to acknowledge. When he approached, his gaze met hers with an intensity that had always unnerved her, the same sharpness that had once inspired desire, now sharpening into something that felt like calculated desperation. "Is he mine?" he asked, the question emerging from his lips with no preamble, no greeting, no attempt at civility, as though the urgency of the truth overrode every social protocol, as though entitlement alone could demand the answer he wanted. His voice was low, steady, but carried an edge that betrayed the turbulence he was trying to hide, the storm beneath his composed exterior. Laura did not flinch. She did not hesitate. She did not allow the words to land with power. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, a subtle yet commanding motion that reminded him that she had built this life without him, that she had survived everything he had chosen to ignore. "You don't get to ask that casually," she said, each word deliberate, each syllable infused with a controlled sharpness that carried years of restraint, pain, and authority. The cafe continued to hum around them, the low murmurs of strangers creating a backdrop of normalcy that contrasted violently with the intensity of the moment, a tension that seemed to pull the room into a bubble surrounding only the two of them. Paul's jaw tightened, the faint flicker of guilt crossing his otherwise impenetrable expression, momentary and fleeting, but enough to remind her that beneath the layers of arrogance she had once admired, he was a man capable of recognition, of self-reproach, of realizing the consequences of his choices even if delayed for years. "You hid my son from me," he said, the words tasting like accusation, but carrying undercurrents of regret, almost hesitant, almost vulnerable, a crack in the armor he had so carefully maintained. Laura leaned closer, closing the minimal space between them with deliberate intent, her voice sharp, controlled, carrying the weight of truth she had never once hesitated to wield. "You abandoned him before he existed," she said, and the words struck the table between them, invisible yet palpable, a declaration that the past could not be rewritten, that responsibility could not be outsourced to remorse. Silence followed, thick and almost suffocating, the kind that carried more meaning than any dialogue could, pressing on both of them with the weight of years and the inevitability of consequences. Every second stretching awareness into a liminal space where the past collided with the present, where old wounds festered beneath composed exteriors, and where unspoken truths demanded acknowledgement before anything else could move forward. Paul's silence was loud, louder than any shouted apology or fevered excuse could have been. It conveyed more than guilt. It conveyed realization, a recognition that he had missed more than birthdays, more than milestones, more than moments that could never be returned. Laura studied him, noticing the subtle tremor in his hands, the sharpness in his eyes that now carried both longing and fear, the way his carefully composed mask threatened to crumble under the gravity of her words. And then, in a whisper that almost seemed to struggle against the constraints of pride and fear, he said, "Please tell me the truth." That single phrase hung in the air, fragile and dangerous, the first acknowledgement that the lie she had protected, the life she had meticulously shielded, was no longer solely under her control. Laura's gaze sharpened, measuring, calculating, knowing that every word she chose next could either draw a boundary, provoke confrontation, or unravel the fragile equilibrium she had fought so hard to establish. The room itself seemed to shrink, the ambient sounds fading into near silence, the low hum of conversation dimmed by the intensity radiating between them, the past pressing forward with relentless insistence. She knew that answering or refusing to answer, would set a precedent, not just for him, but for the life she and Jack had built without interference, for the foundation she had insisted on preserving in the face of neglect, abandonment, and broken promises. And yet, for all the control she wielded, for all the careful planning, for all the emotional walls she had built, she felt the tiniest fracture of vulnerability creep in, the tiniest whisper that perhaps this conversation would not just be about the past, but about the irrevocable future, about choices and boundaries and consequences that would stretch far beyond the walls of this cafe. Would he respect her rules? Would he understand the weight of his absence? Could she allow him into a space she had protected at such cost? Each question demanded attention, demanded calculation, demanded patience, and each one left her suspended in the space between control and uncertainty, aware that nothing would ever be simple again. "Yes," Laura said, her voice steady, precise, and unafraid, each syllable deliberate, like the laying of bricks in a wall that had withstood years of storms. "Jack is your son." The words left her mouth with a clarity that made them impossible to ignore, as if they carried the weight of time itself, the unyielding truth of years spent in solitude, the accumulation of every sleepless night, every decision made without him, every moment of quiet sacrifice that had allowed a child to grow, loved and whole, despite absence and betrayal. Paul's breath hitched almost immediately, a sharp intake of air that betrayed the shock he attempted to contain behind his carefully constructed mask, as though the impact of recognition physically struck him in the chest. For a moment, the room felt suspended, the ambient noises of the cafe, the clatter of cups, the soft murmur of strangers' conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, fading into background static, leaving only the weight of a revelation that had been years in the making. He stared at her, as if measuring the validity of the words, testing reality, searching for a hidden twist that might undo the truth he had long avoided acknowledging. But there was none. Laura did not apologize. She did not soften her delivery with the easy balm of regret. She did not offer excuses, explanations, or attempts at reconciliation. Each omission was intentional, a reaffirmation of the independence she had carved out in his absence, a shield to protect the fragile life she had built from the debris he had left behind. "I raised him alone," she continued, her tone calm yet unwavering, infused with authority and the quiet pride of one who had faced unimaginable challenges without wavering, "and I did it well." The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown, the reality of her achievement, a life nurtured, a child loved, a home maintained without his presence, striking with undeniable weight. Paul's hands, which had previously hovered idle, reached for the edge of the table as if to steady himself, the hard surface grounding him while his mind raced to reconcile the man before him, the boy he had unknowingly neglected, and the woman who had survived without him. Every muscle in his body betrayed tension he could not fully mask, the set of his jaw, the barely perceptible trembling in his fingers, the way his eyes flitted momentarily away before locking back on hers, as though he were both drawn in and repelled by the undeniable truth confronting him. "I would have stayed," he said quietly, the words escaping with an uncharacteristic softness, an almost pleading inflection that revealed vulnerability behind the veneer of control he had honed over decades. For a moment, the air between them seemed to pulse, the subtle rhythm of breaths and heartbeats, creating a tension that pressed against the boundaries of reason. Laura's head shook almost imperceptibly, each movement deliberate, a silent indictment of the choices he had made, the opportunities he had squandered, the presence he had withheld. "You stayed with money, not with people," she said, her voice low and sharp, her eyes locking on his with the precision of someone who understood the stakes better than anyone, who had borne the weight of consequence for decisions he had long ignored. There was no accusation in her tone, only an unwavering statement of fact. the kind that lands more powerfully than any outburst or display of anger could. And in that moment, Paul saw not the woman he had once thought dependent, the woman he might have underestimated, but the full measure of who she had become, capable, resolute, independent, and unafraid to wield the truth like a weapon tempered by years of necessity. He looked at her then, and for the first time in what seemed like eternity, he saw her fully, not as an echo of the woman he had loved, not as a reflection of past mistakes, but as someone reborn through circumstance, forged in the crucible of struggle, untouchable yet undeniably human. His gaze lingered, searching, probing, not for excuses, not for apology, but for understanding, for connection, for any thread that could link the man he had been with the child and woman he had abandoned. "I want to know him," Paul said finally, the declaration slipping out with a careful mixture of resolve and uncertainty, as though each word carried both desire and the recognition of the long road that lay ahead. His admission was tentative, measured, yet carried the weight of centuries of absence compressed into a single moment of confrontation, the recognition that time lost could never be retrieved, only compensated for, if at all. Laura's eyes hardened, a shield rising instinctively, a test not only of his intent, but of his readiness to face consequences long deferred. "That depends on what you're willing to lose," she said, each word deliberate, calculated, infused with the authority of someone who had fought relentlessly to protect the life they had created, and who would not allow recklessness or entitlement to compromise it. The statement was more than a warning. It was a boundary, a challenge, a micro cliffhanger suspended in the air, demanding recognition of stakes that Paul could no longer ignore. He understood instantly that this was not an invitation, not a casual reconnection, not an opportunity to reclaim what he had lost through charm or wealth. It was a trial, a test of his willingness to engage with reality, to accept accountability, to navigate a path fraught with difficulty and consequence, to earn the right to enter a space from which he had long been absent. Paul's gaze flickered, the depth of comprehension evident in the subtle tightening of his jaw, the fleeting softness in his eyes, the restrained exhale he did not allow to escape fully. The words, heavy and deliberate, echoed through his mind as he grappled with the reality that nothing, wealth, influence, apology, could erase the past. The weight of her statement was tangible, pressing against him like gravity, demanding focus, demanding patience, demanding recognition of a truth he could no longer avoid. Could he prove his commitment without breaking the boundaries she had established? Would he respect the autonomy she had fought so hard to maintain? Could he navigate the complexity of re-entering a life that had been meticulously shielded from his presence for half a decade? Each question formed a knot in the air between them, a tension neither could release without careful negotiation of intention, trust, and accountability. Laura leaned back, slightly, just enough to reinforce the weight of the boundary she had set, the authority she still wielded, and the unspoken understanding that access to her son would not be granted freely, that history would not be erased with words, that presence had to be earned, and that trust had to be rebuilt in measured, deliberate increments. Paul's hands relaxed on the table but did not leave it, his body subtly leaning forward as if drawn in by gravity and obligation at once, his breath even but his heart betraying him with a rapid thrum beneath his chest. Silence fell again, thick, pregnant with possibility, with tension, with the unspoken acknowledgement that their interaction had moved beyond confrontation into the realm of negotiation, with stakes measured not in money or influence, but in love, responsibility, and the fragile architecture of family rebuilt from absence. He studied her carefully, noting the calmness beneath the steel, the control beneath the warmth, the authority beneath the years of survival, and realized with a shock that the reunion he had imagined in his mind for years was never going to be the easy reclamation he had secretly desired. It would be measured, it would be earned, it would demand courage, humility, and acceptance of consequences he had long evaded. And in that realization, Paul understood fully that this was not a meeting of reconciliation, but a crucible, a trial, a beginning that would either forge connection or solidify distance. The room seemed to contract around him. Every detail, the hum of the espresso machine, the distant laughter of strangers, the muted clink of silverware, amplifying the weight of the truth he had finally confronted, the challenge that lay ahead, and the recognition that life could no longer exist in the half-realities he had relied on for so long. The days following their confrontation passed in a tension-laden rhythm, the kind of silence that is louder than words, where every movement is measured, every glance calculated, and every sound carries an undercurrent of possibility or threat. Laura could feel it in the mornings, the subtle shift in air, the faint hum of awareness that something or someone was present even when unseen, and she hated it with a precise, controlled fury, because control had always been her currency, her lifeline, and now, suddenly, that currency was threatened by the mere act of observation. Paul had not demanded custody, had not issued threats, had not tried to buy his way back into Jack's life with promises or luxury, and that in itself unnerved her far more than anger ever could have, because it revealed a patience, a calculated restraint that was far more dangerous than rage. There was intent in stillness, and Laura recognized it instantly, like a predator waiting in the brush, quiet, patient, and impossibly focused. He honored the boundaries she had set, yet his presence was impossible to ignore. From across the distance, in parking lots, at the soccer field, on sidewalks he had no reason to occupy, Paul watched with the precision of someone cataloging everything: Jack's movements, his expressions, his gestures, the slight quirks that only a parent could notice, the subtleties that marked a child as his own. Each observation was a stitch in an invisible tapestry, an unspoken lesson in patience, an assertion that he would be present without intrusion, that he would exist without demanding, that he would follow rules without surrendering control. And for Laura, this created a tension that was both unbearable and unavoidable, because every glance, every distance, every deliberate pause in action reminded her that the past she had carefully contained was colliding with the present she had fought so fiercely to maintain. She felt her pulse quicken at times when she knew he was near but did not intervene, at moments when Jack's laughter carried across the field and Paul's silhouette lingered behind the fence, hands clenched and expression unreadable, a man balancing restraint with desire in a way she could neither control nor predict. The first moment of real collision came on a crisp Saturday afternoon at the neighborhood soccer field, a wide expanse of grass bordered by chain-link fences, the kind of place where parents clustered in casual arcs of conversation, the sound of children shouting and sneakers squeaking against the turf, creating a rhythm both ordinary and unforgiving. Laura had been walking toward the field, clipboard in hand, mentally rehearsing defensive strategies in case Jack's curiosity intersected too closely with Paul's presence, when her son's voice pierced the morning with an innocent observation that caught her off guard entirely. "That guy looks like me," Jack said, pointing casually toward the perimeter, where a tall, athletic man stood just beyond the chain-link fence, hands folded in front of him at first, then unclenched as he recognized the child he had spent years imagining in his mind's eye. Laura froze mid-step, the words striking her with a force that reverberated through every layer of her practiced composure. She swallowed hard, the familiar catch in her throat returning with a vengeance, and offered a carefully measured response, one that contained truth but not invitation. "Some people reflect us without knowing us," she said softly, her voice steady, though her pulse raced in a pattern that betrayed her control. Paul had not moved, had not stepped forward, had not challenged the space she had claimed, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. Standing behind the fence, his body taut, hands clenched now and then unconsciously, jaw tight, eyes trained fully on Jack, He was a study in restrained desire, a man who had learned that patience was now a weapon more effective than immediacy, whose every micro-movement communicated presence without violation. Jack, unaware of the history and emotional complexity surrounding the man observing him, continued to play with a natural exuberance, kicking, running, laughing, every movement unconsciously mirroring traits he had inherited, qualities Paul had always imagined but never touched, never guided, never witnessed. And then it happened. Jack scored a goal, his small feet propelling the ball past the goal line, a triumphant grin splitting his face, eyes lighting up with the unguarded joy of accomplishment. And he glanced instinctively for approval. The first gaze he landed on was Paul's. In that instant, Laura saw the subtle shift in the child, the slight hesitation followed by recognition, the fleeting moment of understanding that he was being observed by someone important. Someone whose approval mattered in ways he had not yet fully comprehended. Paul's lips curved into a smile before he could stop it, a gesture unconscious yet instinctive, warmth leaking through his controlled exterior, a silent acknowledgement of connection across years of absence. Jack returned the smile with immediate, effortless honesty, the kind of pure, instinctive response only a child could give when meeting a mirror of self in another. And in that moment, Laura felt the ground beneath her feet tilt subtly, a quiet tremor beneath her sense of stability as she realized that the presence she had dreaded might be more than mere observation. It might be a seed of possibility, an unspoken bridge forming across time and absence. Yet the mini cliffhangers pressed at the edges of her mind with relentless insistence. Would Paul maintain this balance? Watching without interference, patient without overstepping, controlled without collapsing into the desire he had long suppressed? Could she continue to protect Jack while negotiating the presence of the father he had never known, without fracturing the fragile equilibrium of daily life she had so carefully constructed? And perhaps most unnerving, what would Jack sense in the silent exchanges of glances, the subtle smiles, the unspoken recognition that hinted at a father's presence, a connection he had no words for but could feel instinctively in the energy between them? Each question looped through Laura's thoughts like a pendulum, pulling her forward and back, challenging her certainty, challenging her mastery over the space she had carved alone. The games continued, each kick of the ball, each shout, each laugh, a measured dance of normalcy overlaid with tension, a layered rhythm that kept both observer and protector in a delicate state of vigilance. Paul did not intrude, but his very stillness carried intention, a promise unspoken but impossible to ignore. Laura found herself shifting constantly, adjusting positions to maintain sightlines without revealing panic, her mind cataloguing each interaction, each glance, each subtle emotional resonance between father and son, all while holding herself steady, all while rehearsing every future contingency in the back of her mind. She knew that every choice she made in these moments would ripple forward, shaping trust, boundaries, and perhaps the eventual possibility of connection or its collapse. And when Jack ran to retrieve the ball after another goal, momentarily glancing toward the fence, Laura caught the brief flicker of mutual acknowledgement between child and father, a silent communication, instinctual, instantaneous, fragile, and realized that the future, for all its uncertainties, had begun to shift beneath her feet, subtly, inexorably, in ways she could neither fully anticipate nor control. And the weight of that knowledge pressed on her with an intensity that left her simultaneously exhilarated and terrified, knowing that the consequences of these moments would echo far beyond the green expanse of the soccer field, beyond the boundaries of observation, beyond the fragile walls she had built around their life together. That night, the apartment was quiet in a way that felt almost reverent, the kind of silence that gathers itself around small domestic spaces, when the day's routines have ended and the world outside continues in oblivious momentum. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath Laura's feet, all of it became the backdrop for a moment she had been avoiding for years. A conversation she had postponed, not out of fear for Jack, but out of fear for the consequences, for the unknown that waited on the other side of honesty. Jack, fully aware of the calm that preceded her most serious moments, sat cross-legged on his bed, eyes clear and unflinching. And for a heartbeat, Laura froze, the weight of everything she had protected pressing down like the dense air before a storm. She had rehearsed every word, every intonation, every possible reaction over countless nights, yet here it was. No preparation sufficient for the immediacy of a child's intuition, no strategy adequate for the simplicity of a question that carried the full weight of years absent. "Mom, is Paul my dad?" Jack asked plainly, without hesitation, without fear, his voice a gentle disruption of the stillness. A question poised not just for knowledge, but for validation, for recognition, for confirmation that the invisible threads of connection he had felt were indeed real. Laura's heart stuttered violently at the sound of it, her chest tightening, pulse hammering against the constraints of restraint she had perfected over years of solo parenting. She sat beside him, the bed sinking slightly beneath her weight, and felt every molecule of her being vibrate with anticipation, guilt, and relief, all converging into a moment of unavoidable truth. The years of silence, the careful construction of a life that had survived his absence, the battles fought alone, all of it condensed into the space between his small hands resting on the quilt and the intensity in his gaze, wide and unafraid. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady, precise and measured, yet beneath it a tremor of vulnerability betrayed her. "Yes," the word repeated softly in her mind as it left her mouth, solidifying the truth she had carried like a fragile flame, careful to guard it against the winds of memory and consequence, and now allowed to shine in its full, unaltered reality. Jack processed the words quietly, the maturity in his comprehension remarkable for his age, the subtle nod of understanding that seemed to bypass disbelief and arrive straight at recognition. He did not cry, he did not shout, he did not recoil. Instead, he absorbed the truth, like a quiet acknowledgement of something his intuition had long suspected, the puzzle pieces of absence and observation suddenly aligning into clarity. "Is he coming to take me?" Jack asked after a pause, the words hanging in the air like a challenge wrapped in innocence. A question that carried more than curiosity, that implied both an understanding of distance and a desire for reassurance. Laura's chest constricted, her mind spinning through years of preparation, strategies and contingency plans, because she knew that the answer had to be firm, protective and unwavering. She pulled him close, wrapping arms around his small frame, pressing him gently against her chest, heart hammering, pulse racing with both fear and resolve. "No one takes you from me," she said, the words deliberate, imbued with protective authority, and yet tender with the warmth of maternal reassurance. The tension remained, however, a latent presence, because she knew the truth of the world extended beyond her embrace, that consequences and desires awaited beyond the walls of her carefully curated apartment, and that each day would bring new questions, new challenges, new moments of reckoning. The next morning dawned with crisp sunlight spilling across the playground of the local soccer field, the air carrying both the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint metallic tang of early autumn. Jack had been practicing for weeks, alert and energetic, unaware that the adult he had begun to recognize in fleeting glimpses from the sidelines had arrived to witness not just his athletic skill, but the expression of his very essence. Today, he walked up to Paul without hesitation, his small shoes crunching over gravel, eyes steady, steps unaccompanied by the usual hesitancy children feel when confronted by figures both familiar and unknown. "You can sit with us," Jack said simply, decisively, the words articulated with a calm authority that surprised both Paul and Laura, a declaration of inclusion, a silent test of boundaries, a child's articulation of trust yet to be fully earned. Paul, startled by the courage and clarity in Jack's voice, knelt slowly to meet his eye level, the slight bend of his knees a subtle gesture of humility, vulnerability, and recognition of the power he had forfeited through years of absence. "Only if your mum says yes," Paul said, voice trembling just enough to betray the emotions he had spent years containing, the mixture of fear, hope, longing, and reverence that made restraint difficult despite every muscle in his body commanding him to act with patience. The words carried a weight not just of submission, but of an understanding of the rules she had set, the boundaries that had defined their interaction thus far, and the recognition that nothing in this moment was owed, that every movement, every smile, every acknowledgement had to be earned. Jack turned back toward Laura, eyes bright and expectant, the silent question of approval burning in their depths, and the surrounding parents and children paused unconsciously, sensing without realizing it the gravity of a small boy negotiating access to a father long absent, and the careful balancing act of a mother guarding the boundaries she had fought so fiercely to maintain. Laura's mind raced, the undercurrent of anxiety and anticipation, a torrent she struggled to regulate because she recognized the subtle psychological complexities unfolding in real time, the formation of trust between child and father, the delicate negotiation of authority and affection, the silent agreements and concessions communicated in posture, eye contact, and intonation. She had known that these moments would arrive, had rehearsed them countless times, yet the immediacy and authenticity of their enactment brought a visceral awareness she could not suppress. Would Paul maintain the restraint necessary to honor her rules? Would Jack sense the cautious sincerity behind the adult's measured words? Could she allow this interaction without destabilizing the fragile equilibrium of her carefully curated life? Each movement, each glance, each pause carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate playground, and she realized with quiet, potent clarity that the stakes had never been higher. Paul's eyes met hers across the small distance, and in that silent exchange, a tension neither could name settled between them. The recognition of possibility without promise, connection without possession, presence without entitlement. Jack's small hand brushed against Paul's for the briefest instant, a subtle gesture of trust, a quiet acknowledgement of tentative acceptance, and Laura felt the ground shift imperceptibly beneath her feet once again. Every instinct screamed to protect, to intervene, to correct. Yet she held herself still, understanding that the lessons of patience, observation, and boundary setting were now being enacted in real time. That the future of trust and relationship would be negotiated in micro moments such as this, fragile yet profound. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the small trio on the field, the boy, the mother, the father, the surrounding world seemed to fade, leaving only the delicate, charged bubble of observation, interaction, and unspoken understanding. How would trust continue to form? How would boundaries be tested, respected, or crossed? What unseen consequences lay in the simple act of sitting together, of sharing space without expectation, of allowing the tentative threads of connection to weave forward? And in that tension, Laura realized that life was no longer solely hers to guard, that presence, patience, and cautious inclusion would define the days to come, and that the future, fragile and unwritten, was shifting beneath her careful, watchful eyes, carrying possibilities she had long denied herself the hope to imagine. The rhythm of their lives began to shift, slow and deliberate, shaped by the invisible but tangible rules Laura had laid down, each one a line drawn firmly in the sand that neither wealth nor guilt could erase. The mornings carried the faint scent of possibility, the sunlight through the blinds falling in stripes across the kitchen floor, catching dust motes in the air like fragments of suspended time. Paul arrived not with grand gestures or proclamations of intention, but with a quiet, measured consistency that tested the limits of Laura's guarded trust, the precision of his movements carefully aligned with the boundaries she had declared. He arrived on time, each footstep a silent assertion of his willingness to respect the rules, each glance measured, each word carefully weighed. He left when told, his departure as deliberate as his presence, a constant reminder that access was earned, that trust could not be purchased with charm or wealth, that forgiveness was a process, not a transaction. Laura observed all of this with a scrutiny sharpened by years of experience, her brown eyes catching the subtle inflections of his behavior, the micro-expressions that betrayed sincerity, hesitation, or the slightest overreach. She catalogued everything, mentally taking stock of his efforts, aware that every small act carried consequence, and that her decisions now were shaping not just Jack's perception, but the architecture of their future. Jack, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling beneath the adult interactions surrounding him, began to sense a change in the energy, a softening of boundaries where laughter and shared moments grew organically. He told stories about school, about friends, about games and victories, weaving details into his conversations as though testing the waters for inclusion, observing how Paul responded, how his gestures matched or fell short of expectation, and Paul listened, not interrupting, not dominating, not attempting to impress. He asked questions sparingly, allowing Jack's voice to lead, guiding subtly without imposing, honoring both mother and child with a restraint that spoke volumes about the lessons he had learned too late. Laura watched with guarded approval, noting the incremental growth, aware that this slow, patient method was the only way to balance history with possibility, respect with longing, authority with redemption. Each laugh, each shared anecdote, each small exchange was a test, a measure of progress, a fragile step on a path that could just as easily collapse under impatience or miscalculation. One evening, when the household had settled into the kind of quiet that only comes after day-long exertion, when Jack had gone to bed and the dim light of the kitchen lamp cast soft shadows across the countertops, Paul found himself alone with Laura. The air was charged, thick with unspoken tension, the residue of past betrayals and present attempts at reconciliation blending into a moment neither of them could ignore. "I was wrong," he said quietly, the words deliberate, carrying a weight not of apology alone, but of acknowledgement, the recognition of years squandered, of choices that had hurt those he loved, of absence that could never be fully undone. Laura's gaze remained steady, assessing, unmoved by the timbre of his voice, the slight furrow in his brow, the subtle tension in his shoulders that betrayed vulnerability despite his attempts at controlled composure. She weighed the words carefully, the history between them, the life she had built in his absence, the small victories she had achieved alone, and the immeasurable responsibility she carried toward her son. Her silence was not absence, but calculation, a test of intention and accountability, a mirror held to the past and present, demanding that he meet it with authenticity. "That doesn't fix anything," she said finally, her tone even, precise, unyielding, a statement of truth rather than accusation, a boundary drawn without compromise. The words landed heavily in the small kitchen, resonating with the weight of all that had come before, a reminder that remorse alone cannot heal the gaps created by absence, that acknowledgement alone cannot erase lost time, and that trust must be cultivated with deliberate care, not demanded through words or gestures. Paul nodded, absorbing the declaration, understanding fully the depth of the challenge before him. "I know," he whispered, voice low, carrying humility and recognition of the long road ahead. His eyes did not falter. He did not flinch. He held the weight of her gaze as if accepting the consequences of past mistakes, understanding that this moment was not closure, but commencement, not absolution, but opportunity. Laura turned toward the door, each step deliberate, deliberate as the decisions that had shaped her life without him, each movement carrying authority, a quiet declaration that space, autonomy, and respect were non-negotiable. She paused at the threshold, a subtle gesture heavy with implication, a cliffhanger suspended in the room as if the universe itself had held its breath. "Then prove you've changed," she said, her voice soft yet firm, her words a gauntlet thrown across the chasm of history, a challenge that demanded action over promise, commitment over sentiment, integrity over desire. Paul remained standing, still for a moment that felt elongated by the weight of years and the intensity of stakes involved, caught between the desire to step forward and the necessity to honor boundaries, his chest rising and falling with controlled breath, hands slightly trembling, yet anchored by resolve. The space between them hummed with unspoken questions, potential and tension. Could he truly embody the change he claimed? Would patience and consistency suffice to bridge the years of absence? Could he prove, in every action, every decision, every quiet gesture, that remorse and desire had matured into accountability? Time seemed to slow as he absorbed her directive, the subtle dynamics of power, expectation, and possibility crystallizing in the small room. The lamp cast long shadows across the floor, elongating the distance between them, yet simultaneously compressing the emotional weight, focusing their awareness on the moment, the responsibility, the fragile potential of trust, yet to be earned. What would he do next? Would he falter under the pressure of history? Could he meet her standards consistently, without overstepping, without yielding to impatience, without forcing affection prematurely? The room felt like a crucible, testing resolve, patience, and authenticity simultaneously, the outcomes uncertain, the stakes higher than either of them could fully articulate. In the days that followed, the pattern solidified further, each interaction a deliberate negotiation of presence, each moment a microcosm of accountability. Paul arrived consistently, on time, measured, attentive, listening more than he spoke, earning small increments of trust through action rather than words. Laura observed, evaluated, and sometimes challenged his presence, asking subtle questions, setting tasks, monitoring his consistency. Jack flourished in this environment, his laughter more frequent, his stories more expansive, the warmth between father and son growing organically, cautiously and yet inevitably, under the vigilant supervision of a mother determined to protect the balance she had fought so hard to preserve. And even in the small victories, the shared smiles across the breakfast table, the tentative teasing during homework, the subtle glances acknowledging progress, the tension remained, a reminder that nothing could be assumed, that boundaries must remain firm, and that the future, though promising, was fragile, balanced delicately on consistency, honesty, and proof. Would he maintain his patience? Would he respect her autonomy consistently? Would Jack fully trust the man who had only recently become present in his life? Each day, each interaction, each measured step added layers to the unspoken narrative, a narrative of accountability, potential reconciliation, and the painstaking cultivation of trust, one deliberate act at a time. Laura, observing this gradual unfolding, felt a shift beneath her feet, subtle yet undeniable. The power of boundaries had created space for change, for connection, for healing. Yet it also amplified stakes, clarified risks, and demanded vigilance at every intersection of interaction. She understood that love could not be rushed, that forgiveness could not be demanded, and that trust, once broken, required proof over time, consistency over charm, actions over promises. And in that understanding, every glance, every step, every quiet moment with Paul and Jack became charged with meaning, a delicate balance of hope, restraint, and the relentless pursuit of earned connection. 5 years had passed since the life-altering fracture of divorce, a span of time measured not just in days and months, but in the invisible metrics of patience, endurance, and resilience. Laura stood at the edge of the school auditorium, the bright artificial lights casting subtle halos across polished floors, the hum of children's chatter mingling with the low murmur of parents, teachers, and onlookers. The event was ordinary in its formality, a showcase of small victories, talents performed and applauded, certificates awarded, and the delicate choreography of familial pride on display. Yet for Laura, the moment carried a gravity far beyond the simple sequence of presentations. She stood with Paul beside her, tall, composed and present, yet unclaimed by labels or assumptions, a man who had learned the quiet art of accountability, of restraint, of respect for boundaries, and whose presence now shimmered with possibility rather than entitlement. She felt the air around him, a subtle energy charged with years of absence, repentance, and the cautious optimism of trust being earned slowly, meticulously, step by step. Jack, in the center of it all, held both their hands firmly, small fingers gripping theirs with confidence, pride, and an awareness that his role had shifted from passive observer to active negotiator of relationships. The boy's eyes shone with a quiet certainty, the same combination of innocence and insight that had both disarmed and challenged Laura throughout the years. "You don't argue anymore," Jack said, his voice calm, perceptive, the kind of statement that carried more weight than explanation, as if he had been witnessing not just interactions, but the invisible labor of growth, patience, and change. Laura allowed herself a small smile, not the broad, performative kind, but the measured, deep kind that comes from witnessing the culmination of effort, the subtle victory of a long-fought war, fought in silence and discipline rather than confrontation. Paul, standing beside her, answered honestly, the words quiet but infused with the gravity of hard-earned experience, "Because we're done running." There was no defensiveness, no attempt to rationalize the past, no hesitation in facing the reality of his actions, only a calm acceptance of consequence and a steady readiness to participate in the present. Laura looked at him then, really looked. Not at the handsome, controlled man who had once been defined by arrogance, ambition, and absence, but at the individual shaped by accountability, by humility, by lessons learned through distance and longing. She saw a man capable of presence, capable of choice, capable of honoring what had been protected fiercely. She did not promise love, because love cannot be demanded or granted merely for appearances. Instead, she allowed the possibility, a door cracked open, inviting, tentative, but grounded in clarity, boundaries, and reality. The auditorium erupted in applause as Jack approached the stage, small feet carrying him with deliberate purpose, bowing to the audience with grace and pride that reflected not just his own efforts but the steadfast support of those who had protected and nurtured him. Laura and Paul watched, their hands still intertwined with his, a triad of connection formed not by convenience or past claims, but by earned trust, mutual respect, and the patient cultivation of relationship. The clapping resonated around them, not as mere background noise, but as a testament to the layers of work, the invisible battles fought in the quiet, and the victories that had been hard-won through endurance, patience, and integrity. After the applause subsided, Paul leaned closer, his presence close enough for words to carry intimate resonance, and whispered, "Thank you for protecting him." The words were simple, unadorned, but loaded with gravity, acknowledgement, and the recognition of years in which Laura had navigated life alone, balancing the needs of a child, the scars of past betrayal, and the fragile emergence of new possibility. Laura's response was quiet but deliberate, a soft affirmation that carried both conviction and reassurance. "I always will." It was a statement that needed no embellishment, for its power lay in its certainty, in the guarantee that no matter how the future unfolded, she would guard, nurture, and defend the child who had become the axis around which her life now revolved. The moment stretched beyond words, a slow, suspended recognition of the culmination of years. The victories achieved not in confrontation, but in endurance, not in grand gestures, but in consistency, presence, and unwavering commitment. Laura felt the weight of history, the relief of reconciliation, and the subtle thrill of possibility converge, carrying her through a spectrum of emotions so dense, layered, and nuanced that they threatened to unbalance her carefully held composure. Paul, for his part, remained quiet, his hand steady on hers, his gaze on Jack. And in that quiet observation, the strength of transformation became undeniable. No excuses, no rationalizations, no attempts to manipulate, only presence, accountability, and the slow, deliberate proof of change. The air between them seemed to hum with unspoken narratives, years of absence, the quiet erosion of trust, the painstaking rebuilding of connection, the silent lessons of boundaries and respect, the recognition that love, while not promised, could emerge organically when space, patience, and authenticity were honored. The moment was a quiet climax, a resolution earned not through drama, but through deliberate, consistent action, through the patient negotiation of relationship, and through the shared acknowledgement of past mistakes, alongside the deliberate cultivation of future possibility. How would trust continue to solidify over months and years? Would the delicate equilibrium withstand the unpredictability of life? Could boundaries, once established and tested, continue to support growth rather than stifle it? The applause, the quiet murmurs, the rustle of the crowd, all receded into the periphery as Laura and Paul and Jack stood together, three figures linked not by assumption or convenience, but by deliberate choice, by endurance, and by the subtle yet powerful affirmation of presence and accountability. Laura understood with a clarity that only comes after years of vigilance and self-reflection that endings are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are quiet, deliberate, and weighted with the satisfaction of something truly earned. And in this quiet triumph, in this space carved by patience, honesty, and unwavering commitment, the narrative found its conclusion, not forced, not artificial, but smooth, resonant, and authentic. The event wound down, and the family began to walk out together, each step deliberate, yet unhurried, the sunlight catching in Laura's hair, the slight wind brushing across Paul's features, and the warm grip of Jack's hand, solidifying the connection that had been meticulously nurtured over years. It was not the ending of stories past, nor the conclusion of possibility, but a victory of a different kind. The quiet assertion that boundaries, patience, and earned trust could yield something deeper, something authentic, something that would endure far longer than passion or impulse alone. Laura glanced at Paul one last time before leaving the auditorium, recognizing fully the man he had become, accountable, present, and measured. There were no grand declarations, no vows of love shouted into the air, no sweeping resolutions. The victory was subtle, internal, and profound. And in that recognition, she felt it. The culmination of 5 years of endurance, sacrifice, and quiet guardianship. The ending did not feel forced. It did not need embellishment. It was earned, smooth, and true. A chapter closed not by drama, but by the patient, deliberate assertion of what mattered most: love, protection, presence, and the fragile, beautiful possibility of connection fully realized. Jack, unaware of the full gravity of the moment, yet fully sensing its emotional resonance, squeezed their hands gently, a small gesture that encapsulated both the triumph of the moment and the continuity of what was yet to come. And for the first time in years, Laura allowed herself to breathe fully, to release a fraction of the weight she had carried alone, to witness a life rebuilt, a family cautiously mended, and a future unclaimed, but undeniably full of promise. Every glance, every gesture, every shared breath in that quiet triumph was testimony to the labor of love, the patient cultivation of trust, and the enduring power of boundaries honored and respected. The ending was not forced, not sudden, not dramatic. It was earned, deliberate, and finally, deeply, profoundly satisfying. And that's it for today's story, my friends. I hope you felt every twist, every emotion, and every heartbeat along the way. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Beyond Color Stories. Your support means the world and keeps the stories coming. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if you were in Laura's shoes? Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, and I'll see you in the next story.